19-year-old.
Modernism was
very glad to be in Los Angeles right now as an art maker, as an artist.
I'm here at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and I've just flown 12,000 miles from Australia to see this exhibition, Australia. According to the Royal Academy, it's the first major survey of Australian art in the UK for 50 years. So, was it worth the 50-year wait? Was it worth the 24 hours I spent sitting on a plane to get here? Well, Australia does contain some of the most recognisably iconic works of Australian modernism particularly. The first 3 quarters of the exhibition, I went from room to room quite amazed at the works that I saw there. There must be lots of empty spaces on walls in Australian galleries and museums at this present time. So much of the exhibition was familiar, mostly in a positive way, and overall I have to admit Australia, the exhibition actually made me feel a little bit proud of the culture of my adopted country and what is produced in the last 200 years. The exhibition is laid out as an historical progression, so it starts in room 1 with looking at Aboriginal art, and then it moves through the early colonial period, and also, really interestingly, it actually includes early Aboriginal art from early contact with Europeans. And then it goes into Australian modernism, and in the last 3 rooms we have Australian contemporary art. So in other words, it's a historical exhibition, and as with any historical exhibition, there are many ways you can actually cut this. There are many different sort of angles you can take. There are many different stories you can tell, different narratives you can put together from this. So which particular story have they decided to tell? Well, probably not surprisingly, it's the story of the landscape. This is generally the thread of the whole exhibition, of the Australian landscape. And I suppose when you think about it, and this is an exhibition for a British audience, probably the most starkly different aspect of Australia is the landscape. So that really forms the thread of the exhibition. Now, that to people living in Australia is a very familiar story that we've heard many times, and in some respects it is one of the dominant threads that you see throughout the canonical art history of Australia, but also as a consequence it does tend to lose some of the complexity, and particularly when we look at later at the contemporary. So with this focus on the landscape, there's a very familiar set of tropes that are played out in this exhibition, and specifically the idea of the exotic and the dangerous landscape. This comes through in a lot of work and a lot of the narrative that is told in this exhibition. It's probably for this reason that Sean Gladwell's approach to Monday Monday, which is a contemporary video piece, forms kind of a pivotal work in this exhibition. It's the very first piece that you see when you walk into the hall at the Royal Academy. It has the room to itself except for, on the left hand side, a map which shows significant cities and indigenous sites in Australia, as well as the title of the exhibition, Australia. And this work by Gladwell is part of the Madis Maximus series that represented Gladwell a couple of years ago when he was at the Venice Biennale. It very much plays on the vastness of the Australian landscape. The Australian landscape as a sublime landscape figured in that sort of late 18th and early 19th century notion of the sublime. So it fits very well within the kind of narrative thread of this particular exhibition. And one of the things I quite liked about the interpretation of his work on the text panel on the wall was that it actually places it if slightly simplistically, places it very much in the narrative of Indigenous Australia. So that when you go into the first room, and the very first image that you see is a very large painting by Emily Kunware, you get a sense of the Indigenous being an integral part of Australia. Now, it could be argued that there are issues to do with the stolen generation, the genocides, the early colonial years of English settlement, which saw a whole scale wiping out of the Indigenous people that is really sort of avoided in this part of the narrative. But one of the things I actually found quite refreshing in these first two rooms is that in the second room, which is kind of a bit of a cul-de-sac to the left, there's actually some works by Indigenous artists from the early years of colonial rule. And I thought this was great because it doesn't just treat contact between Europeans and the Aboriginal population from a European perspective, it actually shows from the Aboriginal perspective as well. That in itself I thought was actually quite a refreshing take on it. Man, that's one fat pigeon. Anyway, I was saying about the very first room that you go into, and it was interesting to see Emily Kunware's work in an international exhibition in which it's placed very squarely within its Indigenous context. The last time I did see a major exhibition of her work was in fact in Japan around about 5 years ago, and in the museum in Tokyo it had a very different kind of context. It was almost framed as an abstract exhibition. And it's always interesting to see how these things are received in other countries. There was also work by Noreen Reid Nakamura from 2007, which was laid flat in very much the same way that her work was recently in Documenta 13 last year in Newcastle in Germany. Then when you walk into the next room, you see quite a contrast to this very confident portrayal of Indigenous Australia when you see the silver trees. Now, for those of you who don't know what a silver tree is a bit of a relic of Australian colonial times. They literally are trees made of silver, and they're meant to show the flora and fauna of Australia. And they're most notable for the fact that often that flora and fauna contains Aboriginal people. Of course, it speaks volumes for how the Indigenous population were regarded in 19th century colonial Australia. And then the theme of the sublime in the landscape, of course, is never far away. And in this room, it's represented by the work of Eugen von Gerhard, who painted Mount Kosciuszko in 1863. That painting's here from the National Gallery in Canberra. And also bushfire between Mount Elephant and Timboon from 1859. And that one in particular shows this, again, this vast horizon stretching out, but made even more dangerous by the fire that's glowing in the background. This theme of the sublime is very much developed and played out in the next room, which is the Australian Impressionist room, particularly in works such as Arthur Streeton's Fires On from 1891. Fires On is a scene of the creation of tunnels for the Blue Mountains as the railway stretched west from Sydney out into the mountains and towards the outback. Vast mountains had to be cut through, and to do this they just dynamited their way through, and of course this was very dangerous work. So even though it's not mentioned in any of the interpretive information, if you look very closely you can see that there's an injured person being taken out of the tunnel. Now this really sets the scene for a particular kind of mythology, a particular Australian stereotype of what it means to be an Australian man. This idea of a kind of a tough frontiersman. And this very much is played through in a lot of the work that you then see in the next few rooms, even into the later sort of modernist rooms. We get the first glimpses of modernity and modernism with Grace Cossington Smith's The Bridge and Building from 1929, which shows the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So we start to see that faceting of painting that we had in much European art around about this time and earlier. And we also see the very first photographs. Now, there aren't many photographs in this particular exhibition. One of them near Grace Cossington Smith's image of the bridge is Harold Casno's Arch of Steel from 1933. This is taken 1 year after the Sydney Harbour Bridge opened in 1932. And it's quite interesting to see a few cars on the bridge at that particular time. And another iconic work in this part of the exhibition is Charles Mear's Australian beach pattern from 1940. Very, very iconic image of the Australian beach with people wearing very 1940s costumes, but again done in that simplified sort of modernist style. And what we're seeing here really is the development of the emphasis of the Australian character moving from this sort of pioneer bushman kind of figure to the emphasis on, you know, the urban modern and also beach culture. We start to see beach culture starting to emerge as being an important part of Australian identity. And of course, in this room, we still see the Bushmen in the form of Sidney Nolan's Ned Kelly series. So it's really at this point that we start to see the exhibition really hit its stride. We see things like Max Dupaine's Sunbaker from 1937, which is actually apparently an English tourist. And also Margaret Preston's The Expulsion from 1952, which is an incredibly political work for Margaret Preston. She was, of course, a great advocate of Aboriginal art. And in fact, one of the beautiful paintings by her, which I've always appreciated, is Flying Over the Shoalhaven River from 1942, which again is a nod to modernity and the role that aviation has played. I mean, aviation has played an incredibly important part in Australian history, and Australia has played a very important part in aviation. And of course the Nolan work is actually part of what I think is probably the strongest part of the exhibition in terms of, and I know I've been using this word a lot, but the iconic images from Australia. John Brack's The Car from 1955, Drysdale's Emus in Landscape from 1950, of course Sidney Nolan, Arthur Boyd's represented here by The Hunter from 1954, and The Mining Town from 1946. And then we go into a room of desert painting, which is really interestingly placed in this particular narrative, I think, because again it starts to think of the indigenous art of Australia as being part of the contemporary, because then that leads us into the contemporary areas. It's at this point of the exhibition where things start to get a bit messy. There was a review on the opening weekend of the exhibition that talks about John Olsen's Sydney Sun from 1965 and describes it as successfully evoking the sensation of standing under a cascade of diarrhea. Of course, The Age in Melbourne managed to pick up on this fairly quickly and get a comment from John Olsen himself. He said that the comments were extremely foolish and it was an attempt to put the colonials in their place. The last three rooms deal with Australian contemporary art, which is probably the bit I'm most familiar with. It's at this point that I felt a bit like the trajectory of the narrative started to break down a bit. Maybe that's just in the nature of contemporary art, really. There again are some quite iconic works such as Gordon Bennett's Possession Island from 1991. Simran Gill is also represented, which is good since Simran Gill is in the Venice Biennale this year. And also Tracy Moffat's Up in the Sky series from 1997, Hussein Valamanesh's Longing Belonging from 1997, which, just as an aside, when I was working in a particular museum about 10 years ago, we were packing that work up and very nearly scratched it with a tape gun. Anyway, it was fine, nothing happened. There's a a very large installation by Cathy Temin. Rosalie Gascoigne's in there, Mike Parr, although I had to admit I would have thought Mike Parr's much more affecting, impactful performance works would have been a really good inclusion rather than his works on paper. Philip Wolfhagen is there, another great painter. John Beard, Bill Henson is represented there, but probably with one of his, let's say, more safe works. Then in the very last room. Now, the very last room I thought was a bit of a anticlimax, really. There's a few, there are good works there. Fiona Hall's Paradisus Terretris from 1989-1990 is there. Really good works that mix sort of pornographic images with Australian flora and fauna. And also Manstillas, of course. You can't have an Australian show without Manstillas. One of the last works in there is a video work by Daniel Crooks that focuses on the sky, and again we get that evocation of the landscape, which is quite appropriate. The last work really in the exhibition is by Danny Mellor, and again touches on some of the themes to do with Aboriginality that we've seen throughout the exhibition. The installation at the end by Fiona Foley was very much almost like a bookend to the Gladwell video at the beginning of the exhibition, and it seemed strangely kind of hidden away, and I think it would have been great if they'd given it more room and given it a much more prominent place within the exhibition. It would have tied it off really nicely. Now, a review in the Financial Times on the 21st of September talked about how the exhibition lacked consistency because it didn't include, some other key players in Australian contemporary art, one of which is Ricky Swallow. To be absolutely fair, I suppose, in the balance of things, the contemporary material does get a fair amount of attention, given that it actually occupies almost a quarter of the exhibition. Particularly having already started with Gladwell's approach to Monday Monday. What is left out of this narrative? Now, for me, at the very end, there is nothing really here that deals with Australia's psychogeographic reorientation towards the Asia-Pacific. That's just not there, and that really has been an important feature of Australian art in the last 2 decades. And really that emerged, 20 years ago in the Keating years. It problematized the relationship of Australia with Britain, and maybe that's why it's not dealt with there, I'm not sure. I did get the feeling that some of the more, I was going to say politically difficult work, but I think more the uglier topics that in contemporary art in Australia weren't really dealt with. Where, for instance, was Ben Quilty's explorations of Australian youth masculinity, for instance, which in itself would have bookended really well with Gladwell's work at the beginning, and particularly as both of them have been the last 2 Australian official war artists. Where was Adam Cullen? Where was Ken Unsworth? Like I've said before about Mike Parr's video works, they went there. What about Brooke Andrews' contemporary rethinking of Aboriginality in a globalised world? I suppose, in summary, like any story, Australia, this exhibition presents, and has to present really, a selective fiction. An historically neat narrative that we can understand, particularly for an audience that might not be familiar with the basics of that narrative. To an Australian coming to this exhibition, it's a familiar story. As well, maybe for some British people coming to this story. And even though, okay, at the very end, maybe it does have patches, it does have some omissions, it really does provide a very comprehensive look at Australian art in the last 220 odd years. And, that's, from a curatorial point of view, not an easy thing to do. Anyway, this is Kit Messham-Muir reporting for StudioCrasher. Now, let's see what's going on with Tate.